and dob a few more points in. Perhaps a little bit more white, and then we'll go back to normal watercolour again. So as to indicate the dark fronds of grasses, etc., against the lightness of the water. Remember what we said, light against dark, dark against light. And this bank is purposely fairly dark in order to show up the lightness of the foliage that's on it. And we're going to have to use normal watercolour again to work between the points of gouache, just to darken up the shadow area underneath the foliage. Here again, if it's too stark, we can actually just use a damp, clean brush to disperse some of this paint. Doesn't matter if it goes over some of the gouache. But really, it does need to be darker. This can be done by painting actually underneath the cow parsley in certain circumstances. And in so doing, enhancing their whiteness. So there's lots of different ways of approach. This is just my particular approach, and the approach that I find enjoyable. A little bit more dark. So you can see we're just working round the cow parsley. And hopefully creating a foreground that looks as though it's got some movement in it, yet is not a massive detail, but gives perhaps more the effect of detail. Now we will use a small brush again and just put a few strands of grass against the lightness of the water. Do a few small dots on the grass to indicate pods or seed heads or whatever. And it's just that fineness of brushwork just highlights the broadness of the rest of it, which is once again another contrary. It's detail against breadth. And in view of video time, I feel that we should leave the picture there, because it's said most that I want to say. Just before we go, I will actually create a bit more movement, so to speak, round the further bank, so as not to make this foreground so cluttered and yet the other lot so smooth. So we can actually create a few points of foliage, etc., spreading out onto the further bank, so as to lead the eye further along into the picture, yet not cluttering the picture up too much with endless detail. Just do a few points on this bank as well, create a bit of balance, a bit of green. And there's nothing more for me to do now but do the odd line where the water meets the bank, and then to get a mount and put it round the picture. As you will see in this second painting, I've got a few lines on it to indicate a scene with a barn and some distant buildings, and it's located once again on a river, and that really is in order to demonstrate the effect of light. There's going to be a different light in this picture to the previous one. It's going to be a little harder, and it has its own appeal. It demonstrates the translucency of the water, and if we've managed that, we've succeeded to a certain extent. So I'm actually going to plough straight in. I've wetted the paper, and I'm going to put some raw sienna along the base of the sky with a hake brush. Not a Chinese one by Pro Art, you'll notice. And then a small amount of alizarin crimson. Remember what I said about the colours toning down as you carry on. But I want, in a sense, a warm sky, even though it is going to be a blue sky, but it's going to be Windsor blue at the top, which is equivalent to the old Prussian blue, more or less. Prussian blue did have the habit of fading, so apparently the Windsor blue is a more effective equivalent. This is, in a sense, going to be the base of the blue sky, because on this small rectangle you're not seeing the whole dome of the sky, and as you probably know, the sky tends to get more and more towards ultramarine the more you get towards the dome, the highest point of it. So we will do the more greeny blue, which relates to the lower part of the sky, which equates with this Windsor blue, and you will see that I will actually use French ultramarine in the reflections in the water. And I'm just going to tip the painting up to let the colour run down, just to merge the wash in. Squeeze out the brush, and we will take pure French ultramarine and take a band of this along the base. Looks a bit harsh, I know. In fact, we're picking up something from the edge of the paper here. All is not lost, as I said earlier. Take some clear water. We can usually get rid of that. So a little bit more ultramarine. And actually leave the top part of the river here, the plain white of the paper. You want to get that pure translucency, which you will see later on and will become evident once the darkness of the banks have been put in and the shadow underneath them. So I just want to heighten that French ultramarine in the base of the water a little bit more, because in a sense that water is reflecting the dome of the sky, while all you're seeing actually in the picture of the sky is the more base part of it. So the difference in the water is in a French ultramarine cast to it, which, as I said, relates more to the higher part of the sky, but does have the effect of reflecting the beauty of that great void that is over the top of it. This is not going to be an all wet in wet picture like the other one. There's going to be a succession of washes in this, but I'm trying to do as much as I can in the first wash. So I'm mixing a bit of Windsor yellow, raw sienna and French ultramarine again, and just using it on the banks around this river. Now in doing so, some of it is expanding into the water. I want to take that away. In certain circumstances it might have been okay, but in these circumstances I want to preserve the purity of the water and the extreme translucency of it. In doing so, I need to get rid of those green expanded washes. So we will put a little bit more green into that. Squeeze the brush out a bit more, because perhaps the brush is a little bit on the wet side and that's what's making the washes expand. Dry them off a bit by using a squeezed out brush. Turn over to the medium Chinese brush and put in, with a little bit of French Ultra, mixed perhaps with a bit of Winsor Blue, the background trees with a distance. So you see we're going to miss out this tree here. It will actually stay more or less where it's put, even though it's in a wet wash. It's surprising how it will stay approximately where it's put. And a lot of people don't always appreciate this. They tend to feel it's going to run away with them and that they're going to get hopelessly out of control. A lot of that is because of the extreme wetness of the brush or the paper. You have got to hit it at the right time, and that comes with practice. Got to wait for it to dry to a certain extent, yet not dry too much. So it's that judging of the time that is where the practice is involved. You can only do this through practice. We'll make a few more marks with some light red, French Ultra, along on the grass. We'll perhaps show a little bit of the edge of the banks, but this is going to be shown up properly in a later time. And I think at this stage this is all I can do in this wash, and I will actually dry this off and will be with you very shortly. We've now dried off that first wash, and at the moment I will actually start attacking the barn, and hopefully the rustic quality of it will come through in due course. So cover it all over with one wash of light red raw sienna and French Ultra. Just cover the whole thing. Keep the apex of the roof nice and rocky, because these barns have usually been up many years. And what you're doing actually is creating a small wet and wet wash in which you can work. Now I always like to see, I'm just going to move to the other brush by the way, I always like to see green in an old barn, because the moss of the ground and all its surroundings have usually got into it and merged it in. While I'm here I will take off the base of the barn, merge it into a sense, in a sense into the grass. We can actually etch out the shape of it a bit later on. But what we'll try and do now is get some green into it with some French Ultra and some Winsor Yellow, a bit of raw sienna. Just drop it in, let it, a bit like a watermark, let it find its own level within the area of the barn. If you want to, you can rock the board around a bit to let it move. But at this stage it's difficult to see what sort of order it has in it. But remember, a bit like the atmospheric landscape, you have to start off with big washes and work within those. So we've got the basic colour of the barn plus the green mossy character of it, which relates to its surroundings, and we have to wait for that to dry a little bit. While we're doing that, we will work on these other buildings. Remember with buildings that the simpler you can handle them, the better. Perhaps we won't let it run into the barn, but we'll just go over the whole thing with a wash of the similar characteristics of what I've been painting the barn with. We'll assume the light is coming from the right, so we'll leave the end of that building there untouched on the basis that it's catching the light, and we'll go over the roof and leave out the gable. Remember, don't be daunted by buildings. You can always remember that the simpler you work into them, the better it will be. People get confused by brickwork and all that sort of thing, but if you can remember that, like everything else, that virgin wash is always the best for portraying anything, and the building is no exception to this rule. So we will just work the wash down into the building, and like the barn, we can drop in some other colours if we want. If we want to blue it off a bit, we can drop in some blue. Leave a few gaps for windows. There's another building here, sideways on, so we're going to leave the side of the building because it's catching some of the light. There you've got the bases of a few small buildings in the distance. I will just drop in a bit of blue into it, certain parts, just to vary the wash, because though washes are beautiful, they're even more beautiful when they're mixed up with other colours and the colours are feathering their way into them. That is the beauty of the wet and wet wash. It handles what you put into it and disperses it in its own way and gives its own character to it, which is virtually beyond your control. So while you've got 90% control, that odd 10% is what creates the interest and the unique character of any particular painting. How often you must have heard about happy accidents, and certainly that applies in watercolour more than anything. I'm now going to dry this off again, and we'll just work more into these buildings a little bit more. Having dried off the barns, we're going back to a fine rigger brush to put in an element of detail into the big foreground one. So you can use the brush quite dry. Nature doesn't put lines around everything, but in a certain element with these sort of barns, there is, with their boarding, a certain element of line work involved. The thing is not to be too precise in the way you handle these beautiful buildings. So already you can see there's the beginnings of a structure emerging. Go thick and thin. Go dark in some parts, thin in others, just to accentuate the wobbly character of its structure, which has got that way over the years. Remember to indicate, perhaps from the base as well, a few planks. You can also formulate in the roof a hole. You could say it's a derelict barn. We can leave the structure of the laths underneath that hold on the tiles, and just formulate those by negative painting. In other words, just by leaving out. So you're just leaving out the rafters, or whatever you call them, that support the tiles. And you can formulate any size hole you want.